to educate us a little bit on the Longhorns team that we certainly haven't seen this year. This time we'd like to welcome on Rick Cantu from the Austin American-Statesman. Rick, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Good to be with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Rick, and last minute notice, giving you a heads up this morning, but I appreciate your flexibility. So, Rick, when we first figured out from Michelle Clark-Hurd and from, I guess, the ESPN broadcast of who WKU would play as a 12 seed, and it would be Texas, she said, well, they're a long team. They got one really tall girl, but it seems like you can say that about most teams. But after looking at the roster, that's oh so true. So what is the strength of this Texas basketball team?
Well, first of all, they got two really tall girls. They've got 6'7" Imani McGee-Stafford, and they got 6'5" Kelsey Lang, and both are interchangeable. They're both great shot blockers. So Texas has a height advantage against every team they play from the front court. They have struggled against the good shooting teams in the past, and usually those two young women that I mentioned don't play at the same time. They rarely do the twin tower thing. But they're a tall team. They're a good rebounding team. They're an average shooting team. They're a team that's probably playing better right now than they did midway through the season, which is a good thing for them.
Rick, Fletcher Keel here. What was the reaction on the Texas side of things when the Longhorns found out that it would be Western Kentucky facing them in Berkeley on Friday?
Well, to be honest with you, they don't know much about Western Kentucky. And, it's not like the men's game where you get a lot of men's games on television every night throughout the basketball season. I barely know UConn's roster, and they're the ones that are on TV every so often, and maybe Tennessee. So most of them didn't know Western Kentucky. They don't know Conference USA. They don't know Chastity Gooch, for example. But they didn't on Monday, but I can guarantee you they know her today.
Rick, I was looking at the roster and the schedule of this Texas team once it was announced, and I noticed that they started the year on a little bit of a slow start, 4-8, and now they've won 7 of their last 9 going into the tournament. So what do you think, in your personal opinion, has been the main difference of these two Texas teams in 2 different stretches of the season?
Well, you didn't mention the start of the season where they went 13-0, and they beat Stanford, they beat Tennessee, they beat Texas A&M. Then they lost their best player, Nneka Enampali, a senior forward, for the season with an ACL injury. And it was about that time that they went on that 4-8 skid that seemed like it was just going to just destroy the season. But in the last 9 games, they finally got accustomed to playing without Nneka. It took that long. She was their leading scorer and their leading rebounder, and basically the heart of the team. And it took that long to regroup, so to speak, and now they're playing not as well as they did in the first 13 games, but they're a lot better than that middle portion where they were struggling.
Speaking with Rick Cantu from the Austin American-Statesman in Austin, Texas. And Rick, you mentioned that they've struggled against some teams that have shot the ball well. What other weaknesses, if you're looking from the Western Kentucky side, what other weaknesses would the opposing team try to attack in this Longhorn basketball team?
I think the biggest weakness of the Texas team is they don't shoot that well from the perimeter. They were either 9th or 10th in the Big 12, and the Big 12 only has 10 teams, of course, in three-point shooting. They're not a very good three-point shooting, and when you can guard the bigs, then that forces them to shoot that outside shot. Their point guard is a true freshman, and she just looked a little out of sorts in the Big 12 tournament. She didn't shoot well. She didn't play well. Her eyes were, like saucers. So they're not necessarily weak at the point guard position, but they're very inexperienced there. So, and of course, in big-time college basketball, the point guard is sometimes the most important player.
Rick, 7 of their last 9 have the Lady Longhorns won, but in those 2 games, what was it that had them not go on a 9-game winning streak to end the season? Was it that poor perimeter shooting, or was there something else going on the floor there?
Well, there were 2 games. They blew a 16-point lead to West Virginia on the road with about 6 minutes to go. They blew the entire lead. I just think they got real passive. I think they got too comfortable with the lead and just let it slip away. That's one game that they definitely should have won. The other was against Baylor in the championship game in the Big 12 tournament, and Baylor is just superior to almost every team they've played this year. In fact, Baylor is probably the best team they played this year. I think that Baylor was worthy of a 1 seed. The Big 12 is the number 1 RPI conference in the country. They did get a 2 seed, which is not necessarily bad, but a 32-3 record is pretty good. They just got outplayed in the Baylor game.
There's been a lot, at least in the media notes from this side, about the history of this matchup. There's, the second most matchups from Longhorn history postseason wise is 3 with WKU. WKU coach Michelle Clark-Hurd played Texas, 4 seasons in a row back when she was a player here. But how much is that history talked about from Texas side, especially when they haven't played since the 90s?
Well, I went to the selection show with the University of Texas basketball team, and their former coach, Jody Conrad, who was in the Basketball Hall of Fame, was there. And as soon as Western Kentucky was the name that came up on the screen, she just lit up. She has got the history because of what happened in 1985 and what happened in 1986. And for your listeners that may not know, Texas was on the verge, or they thought they were on the verge of winning the national championship and playing the Final Four at home in 1985, and Western Kentucky beat them in the semifinals of the regionals in Bowling Green on a last-second shot. And that just tore the heart out of the Texas ball team because that was going to be their first-ever national championship, and they were going to win it at home. Then in 86, they regrouped and became the first team ever in women's basketball ever to finish the season with a national championship and an unbeaten record. So the agony of 85 turned into the ecstasy of 86.
Rick, a bit of a fun question here. You've had a couple days to think about it, a couple more days to think about it. How are you going to describe to the Longhorn fans who follow you and read your stuff when they ask you what exactly Big Red is?
Well, they're going to assume you're talking about the Cornhuskers. Nebraska was in the Big 12 for the first 12 or 13 years, and they just recently moved to the Big 10. I know that Big Red is big basketball country because I've seen Western Kentucky show up on selection shows in the men's and the women's for years. And they may not know where Western Kentucky is, the university is, but let me tell you this. I talked to Fran Harris today. Fran was on the 1985 team and the 86 team that played Western Kentucky, and she said that they played the 85 game in Bowling Green, and she said it was one of the greatest road crowds that she'd ever played in. She says they had an extremely great fan base. She remembers that the support for, I guess they call them the Lady Toppers, is one of the unmatched fan bases that she can recall. And she applauded Western Kentucky for its fan base, and she said she remembers a sea of red up there in the bleachers.
Right before we let you go, it seems like about as neutral court of a game as you can have, with both teams playing pretty far away from home in California. But what is your gut feeling? A lot of depth down low for the Longhorns, but some inexperience up top going into this tournament. What is your gut feeling about how they perform as a 5 seed against a 12 seed Western Kentucky?
I think you can throw the 5 and the 12 out because I think Western Kentucky is better than a 12. Conference USA is better than most people think. Of course, I'm a little partial because I graduated from a school in the Conference USA, and that's the University of Texas El Paso, which has a decent women's basketball team, a lot better last year. I think Texas wins the ball game if they can feed the ball down low, and the 6'7" and 6'5" girls can take advantage of the lack of height, so to speak, for Western Kentucky. I saw their tallest starter is only 6 foot. But I think Western Kentucky wins the game if they can get hot. Chastity Gooch, I mentioned her before. I think she's going to be very hard to counter. I don't know if Texas has played someone as multidimensionally talented as she did this year. I think it's a toss-up game. If I had to go with my gut, I would say the Longhorns probably, because they've played more good teams. They've played 8 teams in the NCAA tournament, a total of 16 times they played. That includes a lot of Big 12 teams that were in the top 25. But that's my take. I don't know. I'm usually wrong anyway, but it's going to be a good one. I'm looking forward to going to Berkeley for the first time.
Yeah, well, how are you going to spend your off time there in Berkeley, Rick?
I'm just gonna walk around campus, go to the bookstore, mingle with, just take my camera, look at the sights, maybe go to San Francisco later. I'm lucky. I used to go with the Cowboys when they played the 49ers back in the day when both teams were good. So I love that Bay Area and Northern California, Napa. It's one of my favorite places in the country.
All right, Rick, well, enjoy your time in California. Thanks for taking some time to join us here. That was Rick Cantu, sports writer, and if you look at his Twitter, also rocket scientist for the Austin American-Statesman. You can follow him at Ricky Prep for updates from Longhorn basketball. Rick, thanks for your time.
Hey, I enjoyed talking to you guys.
So we're going to take a break here after talking to Mr. Rick Cantu from the Austin American-Statesman. Stay tuned. We'll talk about what he said and the history of this Lady Topper program coming up here on the Red Zone on Revolution 91.7.